present paper, addressing the audience Paul Samuelson, Radical Economics and Textbook Making, which is published by the Journal of History of Economic Thought, was intended as a contribution to two different issues. The first contribution is to the study of Paul Samuelson's intellectual life and work, and the second contribution is to the history of economics textbooks in general. My claim is that these two issues are closely related. In the case of Samuelson, that making the textbook played a central role in his academic life, and that writing it was a way for him to be relevant on topical issues and to deal with social and policy problems. I had already dealt with this in a previous paper which I published a few years ago in History of Political Economy, and in that paper I studied the making of the first edition of the textbook in the late 1940s. At this time, Samuelson was under attack from conservatives who were claiming that Paul Samuelson was a sort of communist. And Paul Samuelson's defense against these conservatives was to argue that his position was a middle-of-the-road position. This middle-of-the-road position for Samuelson means two things. First, it is a reasonable position between extremes. And second, it is the position of the expert, the mainstream economist. And Paul Samuelson strongly believes that a true scientific position should be reasonable in some way, that it should always ponder arguments that are made by ideological extremes. The present paper deals with the way Paul Samuelson tried to maintain this middle-of-the-road position against a new generation of critics in the late 1960s and early 1970s. This new generation of critics was made of younger people. Some of them were graduate students, and these people were radicals. The argument was that Paul Samuelson's textbook was irrelevant and that the mainstream economics it advocated was unable to deal with environmental issues, questions of racial and gender discrimination, and more generally, questions of power struggles. Paul Samuelson, helped by his team at McGraw-Hill, tried to counter this argument, not really by changing the methodological content of the textbook, but by trying to apply basic economic principles to those questions. So they began to expand the scope of the textbook by adding chapters or passages about the environment, about urban segregation, racial discrimination, and so on. So that's basically the story I tell in this paper. For me, there are two takeaway lessons that we can draw from this story. The first lesson is that the Paul Samuelson I see here through the archives is a much more constrained Samuelson than I thought he was. I thought that Samuelson in the mid-1960s, as an established scholar, was able to pursue any sort of interest he liked. But in fact, when it comes to the textbook, it is very different because the textbook operates in a very competitive market, and it is driven by market forces. And what we see in the archives is that Samuelson has to take into account a lot of market reports in order to make his textbook not only a better textbook, but also a more competitive textbook. So I think that's one of the lessons. The other lesson for me is that the paper shows that textbooks should not be considered as mere repositories of past economics knowledge, and that their role may be larger than that. And it is especially the case for Samuelson, because Samuelson was using the textbook not just as a way to teach economics principles, but as a way to ponder on social and economic issues. Not all textbooks are like this, but I think we have to change a bit our positions toward economics textbook, which, as historians of economics, we tend to study only as a way to retrace the development of economics knowledge at some point in time. And we have to take into account the larger contexts in which they are made.